So here I am starting with part B of the two-part epoxy resin. This is the hardener, and it's always important to pour your hardener first and then your resin after that. It's very important to get a precise measurement because for this particular resin you use a 1-for-1 ratio of part B and part A. Here is part A of the resin mixture. For this particular project I poured 4 ounces of the part B and 4 ounces of the part A. Here I am mixing the two parts of the resin very slowly. For this particular brand, it requires you to mix the resin for 3 to 5 minutes. Now I'm going to start with mixing my first color, which is the dark blue of the ocean. I'm using Bria Reese glitter ink in Lake Blue, which is an alcohol ink. So first I'm pouring my resin into a plastic cup, and then I will pour a little bit of the alcohol ink in there. And I'm also using Liquitex Basics acrylic paint in cerulean blue as well. You mix about less than 10% of color to resin mixture, and then you give it a good stir to make sure that the pigments are nice and smooth. Now I'm going to mix my next color in the coasters that I'm using. It's going to be a teal color. So I'm pouring the resin into another cup, and first I'm going to use the Martha Stewart Pearl Finish Jetstream color and also the Folk Art Satin Paint in the color Patina. And again, just like with the darker blue, you mix a really small portion, less than 10% of acrylic paint to the resin mixture. And then you'll stir that gently as well to make sure that all the pigments are stirred in evenly and nice and smooth. Next, I'm going to mix the white for the ocean waves for the coasters. I'm using less resin for this part, and I'm using the brand Just Resin pigment paste in titanium white. And this is going to help create a foamy ocean wave effect as well. Next, I have 2 cups, one of which I'm putting in these light blue rocks that I picked up at the dollar store. It was a pretty large bag for $1. I'm going to show you how much I had in my cup. I actually used much less than this, and I'll mix it with the resin. In the next cup I'm going to show you, it has real sand from the beach, and I actually put this sand through a small sieve, and I kept the larger pieces of the sand that didn't make it through the sieve. So it just added another dimension and color to the coasters. Give it a real good mix because you need to make sure you cover all of the sand with the resin. So I've got everything mixed together and I'm just going to start pouring everything into the molds. Here I started with the dark blue mixture and I'm doing 2 molds at a time, and you just start to pour the colors in. Resin is a self-leveling liquid, so what's great is it kind of slowly moves into the crevices and just sort of self levels. It is really important that when you're working with resin, you are working with a level surface, which I have an app on my phone that checks the level, and I always do that before I start a project just to make sure everything dries in a nice flat form. So here I am mixing a little bit with my finger, and that looks good to me. Here I am adding the sand and resin mixture to the coasters. This took a little bit longer because this mixture is very thick and I wanted to make sure I got it into all of the crevices in the coaster mold. And I finished with the sand, and now here I'm just adding a little bit of the light blue rocks to my coasters as well. Before I go in and add my white, I'm going to use my little, this is a heat embossing little kind of hair dryer, and I'm just using that to quickly go over the 2 coasters to help pop any bubbles that form in the resin. Naturally, when you mix the resin together, when you're combining part B and part A, you will get bubbles, and the same thing happens when you're mixing your paints into the resin as well. You do get bubbles, so that heat just helps to pop the bubbles. So here I am adding the white, and it's probably the thickest color that I'm adding because the white is very dense, and this is also a pigment paste too. So I've added my white, and now I'm using my little heat embossing tool again. And now this is my heat gun. These are all craft tools that you can purchase anywhere. And so this gun is a little bit more powerful because it really blows a lot of air, so you can actually move the resin, and that's kind of how you get the wave effect with the resin. So the heat gun helps to heat up the resin so it's a little bit more fluid, and this tool really helps to blow the pigments around to kind of get a cool effect. So these coasters are pretty much done. I'm just going in at the very end with a long toothpick to kind of make sure that my little bluish green rocks are not sticking up too much, because this top part of the coaster is actually what's going to be on the bottom of the coaster, what lays against a tabletop. So I just want to make sure that it's pretty flat and popping any last bubbles that I see. So for these last two coasters, I'm just speeding up the video process. I do the exact same thing, except for these two. I started with the sand first, and then I added the blue colors afterwards. I did want to also mention about the particular resin that I was using for this project. I had recently switched from art resin to Pro Marine Supplies, and this is a tabletop epoxy. And I later learned that tabletop epoxy is better for a thin resin pour, and this is a little bit thicker because it's a coaster, so it has a little bit more depth to it. And so instead of using a tabletop resin, I should have used a casting resin. So I will be changing resins next time I do this type of project, but I did want to just note that. Another important point I wanted to mention is that every epoxy resin has a different instruction on how to use. So for example, how long you have to mix it, how long it takes to cure. Every resin is a little bit different, so when you're working with it, just make sure that you fully read all of the instructions before you get started. These coasters are pretty much done. They cured in about 12 hours, and I was able to demold, and then about days later they were perfectly hard and ready to be used. I hope you found this tutorial helpful, and I thank you for watching it.